The great hall of Bastion Prime had never been so quiet, and Ambassador Kethvaran of the Drishari Dominion had never been so afraid in his entire life, as he stood before the assembled delegates of 42 species and tried to keep his voice from breaking. "What I am about to show you," he said, his three-fingered hands trembling around the data crystal, "will change everything we know about war." He pressed the crystal into the console, and the massive display screen behind him flickered to life, showing a barren gray moon with no atmosphere and no life, just rocks and dust stretching to the horizon under a black sky filled with cold stars. The footage had been captured by a Drishari spy satellite hidden in the orbit of a forgotten world deep inside Valar hegemony territory, and the quality was sharp enough to see every terrible detail of what came next. A Valar warship hung in the sky above the moon like a dark blade, and from its belly dropped a single warhead that fell slowly in the weak gravity before striking the surface and splitting open with a bright flash. But there was no explosion. Instead, a wave of clear liquid burst outward from the impact point, spreading across the rocky ground in a shimmering flood that caught the light of distant stars and looked almost beautiful for a brief moment before the screaming started. There were prisoners on that moon, hundreds of captured soldiers from 3 different species who had been placed there for this test, chained to stakes driven into the rock so they could not run, and the liquid reached them within seconds. The delegates watched as the prisoners began to dissolve. It was not fast, and it was not clean, and several ambassadors turned away or covered their visual organs, while others simply sat frozen in their seats, as the clear compound ate through armor and skin and bone with terrible patience, reducing living beings to nothing more than wet stains on the ground. Gray rock. Kethvaran stopped the footage before it finished, because he was merciful, and because he himself could not bear to watch it again for the 11th time. "The Valar hegemony calls this compound HV7, he said into the silence that followed, "and they have built weapons around it that they call hydro-dissolution munitions, and they have enough of them to drown every inhabited world in the 3 contested star systems of the Kishara frontier." The silence broke into chaos. Delegates shouted and argued and demanded answers and threatened and pleaded, all at once, their translators struggling to keep up with 42 languages spoken simultaneously, in voices that ranged from deep rumbles to high-pitched whistles of pure panic. General Morath of the Yatheri Compact, a broad and heavily armored creature who had fought in 9 wars and won 7 of them, stood and slammed his fist on the table hard enough to crack it. He growled, "We find a way to neutralize this compound, and we strike back before they can use it." Kethvaran shook his head slowly. "We have tried," he said. "We have tried everything, General, and I mean everything." He pulled up a new display showing failed test after failed test, each one more desperate than the last, and the results were always the same. Protective suits dissolved on contact with HV7 within minutes, because the compound seeped through every known material eventually, finding the tiny gaps between molecules and working its way inside like a patient predator. Energy shields were useless, because HV7 was not energy, but a physical liquid that simply passed through barriers designed to stop plasma bolts and laser fire. Atmospheric scrubbers could filter some of it from the air, but not fast enough to matter when the Valar could deliver thousands of tons of it in a single bombardment. Chemical neutralizers reacted with HV7 in unpredictable ways that often produced compounds even more dangerous than the original. "Every path leads to the same conclusion," Kethvaran said, and his voice was flat now, emptied of hope. "We cannot stop this weapon, we cannot survive this weapon, and the Valar know it." As if on cue, the communications officer announced an incoming transmission from the Valar hegemony, and Supreme Commander Drethak appeared on the screen, massive and scaled and radiating the calm confidence of someone who knew he had already won. His message was simple, and delivered without any attempt at diplomacy. The 3 star systems of the Kashara frontier will be transferred to hegemony control within 30 standard rotations, he said. Any resistance will be met with full hydro bombardment of every populated world in those systems. And if the Concord attempts military intervention, we will extend that bombardment to your homeworlds as well. Dark. General Marath sat down slowly, and for the first time in his long career, he looked like a creature who had run out of options. The emergency session continued for 6 more hours, and every proposal was shot down, and every strategy was dismantled, and every hope was crushed under the weight of a simple truth that none of them could escape. The Valar had created the perfect weapon, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. Kethvaran was preparing to draft the formal surrender document, his heart heavy and his mind numb, when a junior communications officer approached him with a confused expression on her face. "Ambassador," she said, "we have received a request from a recently contacted species on the far edge of Council space, a species called Humans." Kethvaran barely looked up. "What do they want?" "They say they have been monitoring our communications about the Hydro crisis, and they are requesting permission to examine a sample of the compound HV7. Kethvaran almost dismissed it, almost waved his hand, and told her to file it with the thousands of other desperate offers from minor species trying to gain political favor by pretending they could help. But something stopped him. Maybe it was desperation, or maybe it was the fact that he had nothing left to lose, or maybe it was simply the strange confidence in the human transmission that did not sound like political maneuvering, but like genuine scientific curiosity. "Grant it," he said. "Grant them access to Research Station Anthera 12, and give them whatever they need." The communications officer nodded and left, and Kethvaran returned to his surrender document, not knowing that he had just made the single most important decision in the history of the Galactic Concord. Somewhere in the dark between stars, a small human vessel called the Carson changed course toward Anthera 12, carrying a crew of 12 scientists and Marines. Were about to turn the entire galaxy upside down with nothing more than a simple truth that no alien species had ever imagined possible. Captain Elena Vasquez stood on the bridge of the Carson and read the classified briefing on HV7 for the 3rd time. And then she leaned back in her chair and started to laugh, quietly at first, and then louder, until her chief science officer, Dr. Tomas Herrera, looked up from his own console with raised eyebrows. "Captain," he said, "are you all right?" Vasquez wiped her eyes and took a deep breath and shook her head. "Tomas," she said, "you need to read this molecular analysis right now." Herrera took the datapad and read it, and then read it again, and then looked up at Vasquez with an expression that slowly transformed from confusion to disbelief, to something that looked very much like the grin of a person who had just been handed the greatest joke in the universe. "Is this serious?" he asked. "Serious," Vasquez said. Herrera set the datapad down carefully and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. "Well," he said finally, "this is going to be fun." The Carson flew on through the dark, carrying its crew toward a destiny that none of them could have predicted, and a moment that would be remembered for as long as civilizations existed among the stars. Research Station Anthera 12 was the most heavily quarantined facility in the entire Galactic Concord. A spinning ring of reinforced metal and triple-sealed laboratories orbiting a dead star that nobody had any reason to visit, which made it the perfect place to store the most dangerous substance in known space. Station Director Olith of the Drishari had spent the last 40 rotations living in a state of constant dread, sleeping in his hazmat suit and checking the containment seals on the HV7 sample every 2 hours, because he understood better than anyone what would happen if even a single drop escaped into the station's atmosphere. When he received word that a human ship was approaching, and that the crew wanted to examine the compound, he assumed it was some kind of mistake. When he was told it was not a mistake, and that the Concorde had personally authorized the visit. He assumed the Concorde had lost its collective mind. But orders were orders, and so Olaf stood in the station's docking bay with his entire research team behind him, all of them wearing full environmental protection suits with sealed breathing systems and reinforced gloves. And he watched the human vessel connect to the airlock with a soft clank that echoed through the metal walls. The airlock opened, and the humans walked out, and Olaf's first thought was that they were surprisingly small. There were 12 of them, led by a woman with dark hair pulled back from her face and calm brown eyes that scanned the docking bay with quick intelligence. And beside her walked a man with gray at his temples and glasses perched on his nose, who was already reading something on a handheld device and not paying attention to where he was going. "Director Olaf," the woman said, extending her hand in what Olaf had been briefed was a human greeting gesture. "I am Captain Elena Vasquez, and this is Dr. Tomas Herrera, our chief xenochemist, and we appreciate you accommodating us on short notice." Olaf did not take her hand because his own hands were sealed inside 3 layers of protective material, but he nodded politely and led them through the station toward the primary containment laboratory. Along the way, he explained the dangers. He showed them holographic diagrams of how HV7 attacked organic tissue at the molecular level, breaking apart cellular walls and dissolving the proteins that held living things together. And he described in careful detail how even a tiny amount of the compound on exposed skin would begin the dissolution process within seconds. The humans listened and nodded and asked questions that Olaf found strangely specific. Dr. Herrera wanted to know the exact molecular weight of the compound, and then he wanted to know its pH level, and then he wanted to know its boiling point and its freezing point, and whether it had been tested for electrical conductivity. Olaf answered every question with the grim patience of a man who was used to explaining terrible things to people who did not yet understand how terrible they were. They reached the primary containment lab, a room with walls 3 meters thick and a single transparent observation window made of layered crystal that could withstand a direct plasma strike. And behind that window, suspended in a magnetic field, inside a sealed chamber, inside another sealed chamber, inside a third sealed chamber, was a small glass vial containing approximately 200 milliliters of HV7. The liquid was perfectly clear and caught the light in a way that made it look almost innocent, like something you might find in a stream on a peaceful world far from war. "There it is," Olaf said, and his voice carried the weight of someone showing visitors a caged monster, the single most destructive substance ever weaponized by any species in the history of the Galactic Concorde. Dr. Herrera pressed his face close to the observation window and stared at the vial for a long time without speaking. And then he pulled out his handheld device and ran some calculations and stared at the results and ran them again. "Director Olaf," he said slowly, "I need to ask you some questions about your analysis." "Of course." "Your report says that HV7 has a molecular structure consisting of 2 hydrogen atoms bonded to a single oxygen atom. Is that correct?" "That is correct." "And the pH level you recorded was approximately 6 to 7, slightly acidic due to dissolved carbon dioxide." "Also correct. And that acidity is part of what makes it so destructive to organic." "And the boiling point is approximately 373 standard thermal units. And the freezing point is approximately 273 standard thermal units." Olaf blinked his 4 eyes in confusion, because the human seemed to be reciting the data as if he already knew it, which made no sense at all. "Dr. Herrera," Olaf said carefully, "assure you that this compound is extremely dangerous, and I would ask that you treat this briefing with the seriousness it—" "Excuse me," Herrera said, and he turned to Captain Vasquez and the rest of the human team and said, "Can I speak with my colleagues privately for a moment?" Olaf gestured toward a side room, and the 12 humans filed inside, and the door closed behind them. For approximately 90 seconds, there was silence. And then the laughter started. It began as a muffled sound, barely audible through the thick door, but it grew and grew until Oleth could hear multiple humans laughing so hard that some of them seemed to be having difficulty breathing, and at one point he was fairly certain he heard someone fall off a chair. Oleth and his research team exchanged bewildered and increasingly alarmed glances. The door opened, and the humans came back out, and most of them had red faces and wet eyes, and a few were still making small, choking sounds as they tried to compose themselves, and Dr. Herrera walked straight up to Oleth with an expression that was fighting very hard to be serious and not quite succeeding. "Director," Herrera said, "I need to see the compound directly, without the containment field." Oleth felt his blood freeze in his veins. "Absolutely not. I understand your concern, but I assure you that. You want me to remove the containment on the most lethal substance in the galaxy so that you can look at it more closely? Have you lost your mind? Do you have any idea what this compound does to organic tissue? I showed you the diagrams. I showed you the footage. Director Oleth," Captain Vasquez said, stepping forward with a calm authority that somehow cut through his panic. "We will sign any waiver you need us to sign. We accept full responsibility for whatever happens, and I give you my word as an officer that Dr. Herrera knows exactly what he is doing." 45 minutes of argument and 17 forms that had to be invented on the spot because no protocol existed for what was being requested. But eventually, reluctantly, with his hands shaking so badly that he could barely operate the controls, Oleth deactivated the containment fields one by one and had a robotic arm place the vial of HV7 on a bare table in the center of the lab. Then he and his entire team retreated to the far wall and pressed themselves against it as if trying to push through the metal to safety. Herrera walked to the table alone. He picked up the vial, and the alien scientists made sounds of pure terror, several of them covering their eyes and one of them dropping to the floor in a defensive curl. Herrera held the vial up to the light and tilted it gently, watching the clear liquid move inside the glass, and then he unscrewed the cap and brought the vial to his nose and sniffed it. New. Herrera looked at Vasquez, and she nodded once. He raised the vial to his lips and drank the entire contents in 3 long swallows. The silence that followed was so deep and so absolute that Oleth could hear the hum of the station's power core 3 decks below, and nobody moved, and nobody breathed, and the universe itself seemed to pause and hold its breath while it waited for the human to start dissolving. Herrera set the empty vial on the table and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and turned to face the alien scientists who were staring at him with expressions of existential horror. "It is water," he said simply, "slightly carbonated, a little acidic from the dissolved CO2, but basically just water. And honestly, it tastes like the sparkling water from the cafeteria on our ship, except maybe a little flatter." Oleth's legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed to the floor, not from the compound, but from the complete and total destruction of everything he thought he understood about the universe. One of the human Marines, a young woman named Private Torres, leaned over to her sergeant and whispered, "Sarge, do you think they would let me have some too, because I've been thirsty since we docked?" The sergeant told her to be quiet, but he was grinning as he said it. Within the hour, the footage of a human drinking the most feared weapon in the galaxy was transmitted to Bastion Prime, and within 2 hours it had spread to every communication network in known space, and the galaxy would never be the same again. Pause period. The emergency session of the Galactic Concord began in chaos and only got worse from there. The footage of Dr. Tomas Herrera drinking HV7 had been viewed over 9 billion times across every communication network in known space within the first 6 hours of its release, and the reactions ranged from disbelief to panic to something that could only be described as a complete psychological collapse of entire civilizations trying to process what they had just witnessed. In the great hall of Bastion Prime, delegates screamed at each other across the chamber, while their translators sparked and overheated, trying to keep up with 42 languages, all expressing variations of the same impossible question: how was the human still alive? Ambassador Kethvarin of the Drishari Dominion had watched the footage 14 times, and he still could not believe it. And he sat in his chair and stared at nothing, while around him the political structure of the galaxy crumbled. Reformed and crumbled again, like waves breaking on a shore. General Morath of the Yetheri Compact stood at his seat and bellowed for order with a voice that could crack stone. And eventually the chamber fell into something resembling quiet, though several delegates continued to make soft, distressed sounds that their translators politely did not interpret. "We need answers," Morath said, "and the humans are going to give them to us, now." Captain Elena Vasquez was escorted to the speaking platform at the center of the chamber, and she stood there in her simple uniform, looking very small, surrounded by hundreds of alien delegates, representing species that ranged from massive armored reptilians to delicate beings made of crystalline filaments. And she took a breath and began to speak. "I understand that what you saw in that footage was shocking to you," she said, "and I want to assure you that Dr. Herrera is completely fine. He experienced no ill effects whatsoever. The reason for that is very simple." She paused and looked around the chamber at hundreds of eyes and visual sensors and light-sensitive membranes all focused on her with an intensity that she could feel like heat on her skin. "The compound you call HV7 is a substance that humans know as water," she said. "It is the most common substance on our planet, and it is essential to our survival. We drink it every day, multiple times a day, and without it, we would die within approximately 3 of your standard rotations." The chamber was silent. "The human body is approximately 60% water by mass," Vasquez continued. "Our blood is mostly water. Our cells are filled with water. Our brains function because of water. Every biological process in our bodies depends on it." A delegate from the Pelori Communion, a species that resembled tall, thin insects with iridescent wings, raised a trembling appendage. "You are saying," the delegate said in a voice like dry leaves scraping together, "that your bodies are made of this weapon?" "Yes," Vasquez said. 60%. Yes." The Pelori delegate sat down very quickly and did not speak again for the rest of the session. Vasquez continued, and with each new piece of information, the chamber grew more and more disturbed in ways that she had not anticipated, because she had not fully understood just how alien water was to most of the galaxy. She explained that Earth's surface was 71% covered in water, vast oceans that stretched from horizon to horizon and reached depths of nearly 11,000 meters. And several delegates made sounds of horror at the idea of a world almost entirely coated in the deadliest substance they had ever encountered. She explained that humans bathed in water, submerging their entire bodies in it daily. And a Kreeshi delegate, who communicated through color changes, turned a shade that the translator identified as extreme revulsion. She explained that humans swam in water for recreation, voluntarily entering large bodies of it and moving through it using their limbs for fun. And General Morath, who had faced down charging enemy battalions without flinching, gripped the edge of his table hard enough to bend the metal. She explained that human children played in water, splashing in it and throwing it at each other and laughing. And at this point, a Drishari medical officer in the observation gallery had to be treated for what appeared to be a panic response. And then, because Captain Vasquez believed in being thorough, she explained one more thing. "I should also mention," she said in the same calm, steady voice she had been using throughout, "that humans regularly consume a substance called ethanol. which is a chemical that many of your species use as an industrial solvent and disinfectant. For what purpose? Kethvaran asked, though he looked like he was not sure. He wanted to know the answer. For recreation, Vasquez said. We drink it at social gatherings. It impairs our cognitive function and motor control, and we find this enjoyable. Kethvaran put his head in his hands. In the back of the chamber, hidden among a group of minor trade delegates, a Valar intelligence operative was recording everything and transmitting it in real time to the Hegemony homeworld, where Supreme Commander Drethak watched the feed from his war room, surrounded by his senior military staff. Drethak had ordered a complete biological analysis of humans the moment the footage of Herrera drinking HV7 had reached his screens, and the results were arriving now, scrolling across his display in a long list that read less like a species profile and more like a horror story. Humans could survive in temperature ranges that would kill most species, thriving in environments from frozen wastelands to scorching deserts. Their bodies could repair themselves after sustaining damage that would be fatal to other organisms, regrowing skin and muscle and even bone over time through a process they apparently considered completely normal. They had an endurance capacity that exceeded almost every known species, capable of pursuing prey across vast distances over many hours until the prey simply collapsed from exhaustion. A hunting strategy so terrifying that Drethak's military advisors stopped reading the report at that point and asked to be excused from the room. They consumed capsaicin, a chemical weapon produced by certain plants on their world that triggered intense pain responses, and they added it to their food deliberately because they liked the way it felt. And they were, as Captain Vasquez had just explained to the entire Galactic Concord, 60% composed of the compound that the Valar hegemony had spent decades and billions of resources developing into the ultimate weapon of mass destruction. Drethak sat very still for a long time. He had built his entire military strategy around hydro-dissolution munitions, had staked the future of the hegemony on the certainty that no species could withstand them, had issued an ultimatum to the most powerful alliance in the galaxy based on his absolute confidence that HV7 was unstoppable. And now a small, soft-looking bipedal creature had drunk his ultimate weapon on camera and complained that it was a little flat. "Supreme Commander," his aide said quietly, "what are your orders?" Drethak did not answer immediately, because he was doing something he had never done before in his entire military career, which was feeling genuine fear, not of an enemy's weapons or fleet or strategy, but of an enemy's basic biology. Back on Bastion Prime, the session had moved from shock to strategy, and the question on every delegate's mind was the same. What did this mean for the war? Kethvaran stood, addressed the chamber with a voice that had found new strength from the most unexpected source imaginable. The Valar hegemony's ultimatum depends entirely on the threat of hydro-bombardment, he said, and we now have among our allies a species that is completely immune to that threat. And I propose that we formally request human military assistance in defending the Kashara frontier. The vote was unanimous. Vasquez stepped outside the chamber and opened a secure communication channel to Earth, and the face of Admiral James Chen appeared on her screen, already smiling because he had been watching the session live. "Admiral," Vasquez said, "the Galactic Concord is formally requesting military support against the Valar hegemony. How many personnel can we deploy?" Admiral Chen leaned back in his chair, and the smile widened into something that carried the weight of an entire species that had spent its whole history being underestimated. Supreme Commander Drethak was not a creature who retreated, and he was not a creature who admitted mistakes. And so when the Galactic Concord rejected his ultimatum and announced that they had secured human military support, He did the only thing his pride would allow him to do. He doubled down. Within hours of the Concorde's announcement, Valar warships began bombarding the 3 occupied worlds of the Keshara frontier, with every hydro-dissolution warhead in their arsenal. Not as a weapon against the incoming humans, but as a denial strategy designed to make the planets completely uninhabitable for any other species. If the Concorde wanted these worlds back, Drethak reasoned, they would find nothing but oceans of death waiting for them, and even if the humans could survive in HV7, no allied species would ever be able to set foot on those planets again. It was a scorched earth strategy on a planetary scale, and it was brutal and it was effective. Have worked. The human expeditionary fleet arrived in the Keshara system 14 standard rotations later, and the Allied observers who had been sent to document the campaign got their first look at the species that had turned the galaxy upside down by drinking a glass of water. The fleet consisted of 40 ships, none of them particularly large by galactic standards, built with a practical ugliness that suggested their designers cared more about function than appearance. And they moved through space with a quiet efficiency that the Yetheri military attaché described in his report as unsettling. Aboard the flagship UENS Tempest, Captain Vasquez stood on the bridge and looked at the tactical display showing the 3 planets of the Keshara frontier, all of them now covered in a shimmering layer of HV7 that the Valar had been pumping onto them for 2 weeks straight. "How deep is the flooding on Keshara 2? She asked. "Approximately 15, was the reply. "Centimeters across most of the primary continent," her tactical officer reported. "Deeper in the lowlands, maybe half a meter in some valleys." Vasquez nodded. "So ankle to knee deep," she said. "Tell the Marines to wear their waterproof boots." The Yetheri attaché, who was observing from the back of the bridge, made a note in his report that read simply, "They are insane." The first engagement happened over Keshara 2 when a formation of Valar orbital defense platforms detected the human landing craft descending through the atmosphere and opened fire with a concentrated barrage of HV7 warheads. The warheads struck the landing craft and burst open, and the clear liquid splashed across the hulls and viewports, and ran down the sides in streams that caught the light of the planet's sun. And inside the lead craft, Sergeant Major David Okonkwo watched the compound run down the window next to his seat, and turned to his squad. "Looks like rain." Private Sofia Torres, the same Marine who had asked for a drink back on Anthera 12, pressed her face to the window and watched the liquid streaming past. "Sarge, it is actually kind of pretty," she said. "Focus up, Torres," Okonkwo said, but his voice had the tone of a man who was trying not to smile. The landing craft touched down on the surface of Keshara 2, and the ramps dropped, and 10,000 human Marines stepped out onto a world that the Valar hegemony had spent 2 weeks transforming into what they believed was an uninhabitable wasteland of pure death. The Marines' boots splashed in ankle-deep water. Sergeant Okonkwo looked down at the clear liquid flowing around his feet, then looked up at the alien sky, and then looked at his squad, and shrugged. "Move out," he said. They moved out, 10,000 of them spreading across the continent in organized formations, splashing through puddles, and wading through streams of HV7 that had pooled in ditches and low ground. And from orbit, the Valar commanders watched in disbelief as their ultimate weapon failed to produce a single casualty. The Valar ground forces had been stationed on Keshara 2 to hold the planet after the bombardment, and they had expected to face enemies in heavy hazmat equipment, moving slowly and carefully through the flooded terrain, vulnerable and afraid. What they got instead was 10,000 humans jogging through the water in standard combat gear, moving fast and moving together with the kind of coordination that comes from a species that evolved as persistence hunters on a world where water was as common as air. The first ground battle happened at a Valar forward operating base near the planet's equator, a fortified position built on high ground above the flood line, with clear sightlines in every direction, and heavy weapons emplacements covering every approach. The Valar commander, a veteran officer named Fess, watched through his scope as the humans approached across a wide plain that was covered in 6 inches of HV7. And he could not understand what he was seeing, because the humans were not dying, and they were not even slowing down. And some of them appeared to be talking and joking with each other as they advanced. Fess ordered his heavy weapons to open fire, not with conventional arms, but with point-blank HV7 cannons that sprayed concentrated streams of the compound directly at the advancing humans. Sergeant Okonkwo took a direct hit from an HV7 cannon blast that drenched him from head to boots in the most feared substance in the galaxy. He stopped walking for a moment, and wiped his face with both hands, and blinked water out of his eyes, and then looked up at the Valar position, and said one word that his squad's helmet cameras recorded with perfect clarity: refreshing. Then he raised his rifle, and returned fire with conventional human weapons that were not revolutionary or exotic, but were extremely effective when wielded by soldiers who were not at all afraid of the enemy's primary armament. The Valar line broke within 20 minutes. It was not because human weapons were superior, because they were roughly comparable to Valar conventional arms. And it was not because human tactics were more advanced, because both sides used similar military doctrine, adapted to the terrain. It was because of the fear. The Valar soldiers had been trained their entire lives to believe that HV7 was the ultimate weapon, the destroyer of all life, the compound that nothing could survive, and they had watched it dissolve prisoners and melt through armor and reduce entire battalions to wet stains on barren moons. And now they were watching an enemy walk through it like it was nothing. Fess ordered another cannon barrage and watched a human marine take the blast full in the chest and stumble back one step, and then shake her head like a wet dog and keep advancing. And something broke inside Fess that had nothing to do with tactics or strategy, and everything to do with the fundamental terror of facing an enemy that could not be hurt by the one thing you had always believed made you invincible. The Valar soldiers began to retreat, and then the retreat became a rout, and then the rout became a complete collapse, as unit after unit abandoned their positions and fled from an enemy that splashed through their doomsday weapon like children playing in rain puddles on a spring afternoon. Across all 3 planets, the pattern repeated itself. On Keshara I, human marines waded through waist-deep HV7 to assault a Valar stronghold built in a flooded valley, and the Valar garrison surrendered without firing a shot, because they could see the humans coming through the liquid that was supposed to kill everything it touched, and they simply could not bring themselves to fight. On Keshara III, a Valar tank column opened fire with HV7 mortars on an advancing human platoon and scored direct hits on every single soldier, and the platoon did not even break stride, and the tank crews abandoned their vehicles and ran. In 72 hours, it was over. 10,000 humans had retaken 3 planets against a defending force of over 50,000 Valar soldiers, and they had done it not with superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but with the simple and devastating fact that they were biologically immune to the enemy's most powerful weapon, and the enemy could not psychologically handle that reality. Sergeant Okonkwo stood on the steps of the captured Valar Command Center on Keshara II, his uniform still damp from the day's fighting, and he looked out over a landscape flooded with the weapon that had terrorized the galaxy, and he thought that it looked a lot like the rice paddies near his grandmother's village in Nigeria after the monsoon rains. Torres came up beside him and held out a canteen. "Water, Sarge," he said. He took it and drank, and the liquid was warm and tasted like the inside of a metal container. It was nothing special at all, just water, just the most ordinary thing in the world. Far away on the Valar homeworld, Supreme Commander Drethak received the reports of total defeat on all 3 fronts. He sat in his war room alone because he had dismissed everyone else. He stared at the wall and asked himself a question that burned in his mind like a star going dark. What do the humans fear? Because he needed to find something, anything, that could stop them, or the hegemony was finished. The Valar hegemony throne world of Axthar Prime was a dry and ancient place, a world of red stone and thin air, and vast deserts that stretched beneath a sky the color of burnt copper. And it was here in the deepest chamber of the Obsidian Citadel that Supreme Commander Drethak made his final desperate decision. He would abandon the hydro weapons entirely and launch a massive conventional strike against human colonies using antimatter warheads, the kind of weapons that did not care whether their targets were made of water or stone or anything else, because they simply erased matter from existence. His fleet was assembled, and his officers were briefed, and the coordinates of 6 human colony worlds were locked into the navigation systems of 200 warships, and all Drethak had to do was give the order. He never got the chance. A single human diplomatic shuttle dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Axthar system, unarmed and unescorted, broadcasting on all frequencies a simple message requesting permission to land for diplomatic negotiations. Drethak's fleet commander wanted to destroy it immediately, but Drethak was a tyrant and a warmonger. But he was not stupid, and he knew that killing a diplomatic vessel would turn every neutral species in the galaxy against the hegemony permanently, and so he granted landing permission with the private intention of hearing whatever the humans had to say, and then launching his attack anyway. The shuttle landed on the red stone landing platform of the Obsidian Citadel, and the ramp lowered, and Captain Elena Vasquez walked out into the thin, dry air of Axthar Prime, carrying nothing but a sealed cooler in her right hand. She was escorted by 12 Valar elite guards, each one standing over 2 meters tall and covered in dark-scaled armor that made them look like walking nightmares. And they led her through corridors carved from black stone into the throne room where Drethak waited. He was enormous, even by Valar standards, a creature built for war, with 4 arms and a jaw full of teeth designed for tearing, and eyes that glowed a faint orange in the dim light of the chamber. And he sat on a throne carved from the bones of a great beast that had once ruled the deserts of Axthar Prime before his ancestors had hunted it to extinction. Vasquez walked across the stone floor and stopped at the prescribed distance and looked up at him without any visible fear, which irritated Drethak more than he wanted to admit. "Supreme Commander," she said, "I am here to present terms." "Terms?" Drethak repeated, and his voice was deep enough to make the stones vibrate. "You come to my homeworld, to my throne room, alone, and you speak to me of terms?" "I do," Vasquez said. "Then speak quickly, because my patience for humans is very nearly exhausted." Vasquez set the cooler down on the floor, and straightened up and met his glowing eyes directly. "Full withdrawal from the Kashara frontier, effective immediately," she said. "Reparations paid to the species whose citizens were killed in the hydro weapons testing program. Complete and verified dismantlement of all hydro-dissolution munitions and the facilities that produce them, and a formal declaration of non-aggression filed with the Galactic Concord." Drethak leaned forward on his throne, and the guards shifted nervously, because when the Supreme Commander leaned forward, it usually meant someone was about to die. "And if I refuse," he said, "then things become much less pleasant for the hegemony," Vasquez said. Drethak laughed, a sound like boulders grinding together in an avalanche. "You have no leverage, human," he said. "You happen to be immune to one weapon, and you won a few battles against demoralized troops. But you are a small species from a single unremarkable world, and you do not have the strength to threaten the hegemony itself." "I brought you a gift," Vasquez said, and she bent down and opened the cooler. Inside, packed in ice that was itself frozen water, and therefore technically also a weapon of mass destruction by Valar standards, were several bottles of clear liquid and a few metal cans, and one small glass bottle filled with a dark red substance. Vasquez pulled out a bottle of water and held it up. "This is water," she said, "your ultimate weapon. We sell it in our stores for less than 1 unit of our currency. Children carry it in their bags to school. We give it to our pets." She set it down and pulled out a metal can. "This is carbonated water," she said. "We add gas to your weapon to make it fizzy, because we think it tastes better that way." She set that down too, and then picked up the small glass bottle with the red substance inside. "And this," she said, "is something we call hot sauce." "What does it do?" Drethok asked, despite himself. "It contains a chemical called capsaicin that triggers intense pain in the nerve receptors of the mouth and throat," Vasquez said. "We add it to our food, including to water, because we enjoy the sensation of pain while we eat." She paused to let that sink in. "You wanted to know what humans are," she said. "We are a species that drinks your weapons and poisons our own food for fun, and hunts by chasing prey until it collapses from exhaustion, and heals from injuries that would kill your soldiers, and builds cities at the bottom of mountains that could erupt and destroy them, and sails across oceans of the most dangerous substance you have ever encountered, in ships made of wood." She unscrewed the cap of the water bottle and poured herself a glass from a cup she had brought in the cooler, and she drank it slowly while maintaining direct eye contact with the most powerful military leader in the Valar hegemony. Drethok watched her drink the weapon that had been the foundation of his empire's military dominance, and he said nothing. "But," Vasquez continued, setting the glass down, "we are also a species that would rather talk than fight when talking is an option, and that is why I am here instead of a fleet." Drethok's aide, a thin, nervous Valar named Kas, who had been standing in the shadows trying to be invisible, moved forward and whispered something in the Supreme Commander's ear. Drethok's expression changed. "What did you just say to me?" he said to Kas. Kas swallowed and whispered again, louder this time, loud enough that Vasquez could hear. "Supreme Commander, our long-range sensors have detected a human fleet that arrived in the outer system approximately 12 minutes ago. It consists of over 300 warships, and it is currently holding position around our fourth moon in standard combat formation." Drethok looked at Vasquez. Vasquez looked at Drethok. "The fleet is Admiral Chen's idea," she said. "He is cautious by nature, but those ships will leave the moment you sign the agreement, and I would very much prefer that outcome, because I have been traveling for a long time, and I would like to go home." The silence in the throne room stretched out like a living thing, filling the space between the small human woman and the massive Valar commander. And in that silence, Drethok calculated odds and weighed pride against survival, and thought about a species that drank death and ate pain and chased its prey to exhaustion, and still preferred to offer peace before war. He reached out with one of his 4 hands, and Kas placed a document stylus in it. "If I sign this," Drethok said, "the hegemony will be diminished." "The hegemony will be alive," Vasquez said, "and there is a great deal you can build from alive." Drethok looked at her for a long time, and then he signed the treaty with a single sharp stroke. The galaxy was at peace in a way it had not been for generations. The hydro-dissolution munitions program was dismantled completely, its warheads drained, and its facilities converted to civilian use. And the compound HV-7 became the most famous joke in the history of the Galactic Concord, referenced in comedy shows and political speeches, and even a popular children's song on the Drishari homeworld about the funny aliens who drank the scary water. Humanity took its place as a permanent member of the Concord's Security Council, serving not as conquerors or overlords, but as peacekeepers and mediators, a role that suited them better than anyone had expected, because it turned out that a species immune to the galaxy's greatest fear was very good at convincing frightened people that things were going to be all right. Dr. Tomas Herrera returned to academia and published a paper titled Dihydrogen Monoxide, a comparative analysis of cross-species biochemical responses, the most downloaded scientific document in galactic history. Sergeant Major David Okonkwo retired from active service and opened a restaurant on Bastion Prime that served human food to adventurous aliens. And his most popular dish was a spicy soup that made Drishari customers weep with pain and then immediately order another bowl. Private Sofia Torres was promoted twice and assigned to a joint species training program where she spent most of her time patiently explaining to horrified alien recruits that the water in their canteens was not going to kill them. And Captain Elena Vasquez, a woman who had faced down the most powerful warlord in the galaxy with a cooler full of water and hot sauce, finally got her leave approved. She went home to Portugal, to a small town on the coast where her parents still lived in a white house on a hill overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. And on her first morning back, she walked down the stone path to the beach and kicked off her shoes and waded into the surf. The water was cold and salty, and it surged around her ankles, and then her knees, and then her waist as she walked further out. And the sun was warm on her face, and the sky was very blue, and the waves lifted her gently as she leaned back and floated on the surface of the largest body of the most feared weapon in the galaxy. She closed her eyes and smiled, and let the ocean hold her. Far above, in a diplomatic office on Bastion Prime, Ambassador Keth Varin was having a video call with his new human liaison, and he happened to ask where Captain Vasquez was spending her leave. The liaison smiled and patched through a satellite feed that showed the coast of Portugal from orbit, a thin line where green land met blue water that stretched to the horizon in every direction, and then the image zoomed in to show a single small figure floating peacefully in the waves. Keth Varin stared at the image for a long time. Young Drishari, who had been born after the Hydro crisis and had grown up in a galaxy where humans were allies and protectors. And the water joke was old news. They live in it, Keth Varin whispered, and his voice carried the echo of a being who had watched his universe transform completely and was still trying to understand how. They actually live in it. His aide looked at the screen, and then looked back at the ambassador, and shrugged in the way that young people shrug when older people are amazed by things that seem perfectly obvious. Of course they do, the aide said. They are humans. And far below on the surface of a small blue world that was covered in the most dangerous substance the galaxy had ever known, Elena Vasquez floated in the Atlantic Ocean and thought about nothing at all, and the water held her up, as it always had, as it always would.